Okay, good morning. Welcome everybody. So welcome back. So as I wrote in my email, hello. So we're going to continue with the lecture that I planned last week. So I'm sorry for that, but I simply couldn't talk last week. So I'm going to continue with the European Monetary Union. We will not do the lecture on financial crisis, but we're going to subsume it today, because today we're going to talk about crisis when we talk about the Eurozone problems in the second half of this course. And then next week we're going to go on as planned. We will do the concluding lectures on globalization and democracy next week. As I wrote in my other email, you have the opportunity to ask specific questions about the course content today and next week, and we could even meet if you send a specific list of questions beforehand. What we will not be able to do is to give you emergency responses right before the exam, right? So if you have questions, you can ask them, but you have to do it now during the teaching term. So has anybody prepared any questions? Do you have questions? You can ask them now, you can ask them next week, or send a list. You can also ask them in the tutorial, actually. No questions? So I'm going to ask you again next week. So if you think you might have questions, go through the course material again and ask the questions next week. So, we're going to talk about the European Monetary Union, and we're going to do a mix of the historical evolution of the European monetary system and the monetary union, or European monetary integration more generally, and we're going to rely on all the theories that we've discussed in the last few weeks. So we talked about credibility problems, we talked about interest groups, and all these theories apply to explain European monetary integration. So that's what we will do in the first part. I'm going to discuss how, after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, we saw the emergence of the so-called snake that then turned into the European monetary system, that then turned into the European Monetary Union. So this is really related to what happened on a global level when the Bretton Woods system broke down in the early 1970s. To explain this, we're going to touch upon an economic theory, which you probably have heard, optimum currency areas, but as we're going to see, this does not really explain why we have the European Monetary Union. So there's an economic theory, again, we had the situation already when we talked about trade. There's an economic theory that offers an explanation, but it doesn't really apply, or doesn't really apply to what really happened. And the explanatory power of this theory is small. So we're going to touch upon intergovernmental bargaining, which has appeared in the literature on European integration more generally. So there's neo-functionalism and intergovernmentalism. So there's an intergovernmental explanation of European monetary integration, but what is more convincing is actually a more functionalist approach, which is about exporter interests, government credibility, and so on. Then we're going to talk about the crisis, and we're going to look at different explanations, especially the idea of fiscal slack in crisis countries or competitiveness issues. Those are the political economy explanations of the Eurozone crisis. And we're going to see that the fiscal slack argument is actually not very convincing, while the competitiveness argument is more convincing. And then we're going to talk about crisis resolution, lender of last resort problems, the adjustment costs, and political support from the donor countries to international bailout. So again, here we're going to use theories that we've discussed before. The lender of last resort issue already appeared when we talked about Kindleberger and hegemonic stability. Adjustment cost was a central component of the Bretton Woods discussion and in the last session. So we're going to use bits and pieces from what we've learned to explain what's happening in Europe. So let's just do a quick historic review. So the motivation for European monetary integration, in some ways, that's not the only motivation, but one motivation was to address the instability that was arising with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. So when the Bretton Woods system collapsed, there was the so-called Smithsonian Agreement, which specified how exchange rates could vary on the global level. And what was specified back then was that vis-a-vis the anchor currency, which was the US dollar, currencies could fluctuate within a band of plus minus 2.25%. So what does it mean for European countries? So suppose you're a European country that's fluctuating from the lower bound of the band, so minus 2.25, to the upper bound, plus 2.25%. So you vary by your exchange rate increases by 4.5%. Now, if you're another country that fluctuates exactly in the other direction, that goes from the top of the band to the bottom of the band, this exchange rate decreases by 4.5% vis-a-vis the US dollar. That means that European currencies could vary up to 9% vis-a-vis each other. And that's a lot. And that was thought to be too much. So the idea was to establish, to narrow these bands to 4.5% and establish international institutions that would address financial problems that might arise in the system. And one was the European Monetary Cooperation Fund, which was an institution where the central bank governors would meet and coordinate their policies. And there was a financing facility as well. So what this looks like, and what this, so this should look familiar to you, right? The idea is very similar to the Bretton Woods system. So those are small versions of the IMF in some ways that were established on the European level. So the snake, the so-called snake, is a small Bretton Woods system on the European level. The problem is that it didn't work very well. So it was established in the early 1970s, and what happened was that the pound, the franc, the Italian lira, they left within this period. Then France tried to come back in 1975, and they left again. And what we ended up with in 1976 was a zone of countries that were aligned with the German mark, so Belgium, Denmark, and so on, and the other ones were out. So that was not the idea originally. So this failure led to the idea that we should try it again, and this led to the European monetary system, which was again very similar, but worked better afterwards. So there was the agreement between the French government under the presidency of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and the German government under the Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who again thought we should have a more stable exchange rate system. And they proposed now a system with an even narrower band of 2.25% and the possibility of revaluing this, the exchange rate if there is fundamental imbalances. So again, this should sound familiar. That's again an attempt to establish a small Bretton Woods type of system in Europe. So it worked fairly well in 1979 to 1985 to 1981. But from 1981 to 1983, the French currency had to be revalued 3 times. And I talked about this quickly already before. What happened in this period? So why did the French currency suddenly destabilize? And there was speculation against the franc staying within the system. It's all about politics, right? Yes. So in 1981, Mitterrand was elected president, and he pursued an expansionary fiscal policy or economic policy because he ran on a platform that promised that. And that led to these instabilities. And in 1982, 1983, they actually changed the policy. So under the Jacques Delors was the finance minister, and they announced a policy shift in 1982 and 1983 towards a policy that was consistent with the German economic policy. And from then onwards, the system stabilized. And from 1987 to 1991, there were no more devaluations of any currency within the system. So already in the 1970s, there were ideas to actually push forward towards a true monetary union, to have a common currency. And these ideas were revived in the 1980s when Jacques Delors was now president of the European Commission, and he proposed that there was a stagflationary period, so in Europe, and the Commission proposed to actually push forward to monetary union, so that that could be a solution for these economic problems. And that was negotiated from 1989 onwards. And that was then written down in the Maastricht Treaty, which was signed in 1991. So the idea was the following, that we would proceed in three stages. The first stage starts in 1990 to 94, where countries would gradually reform their domestic monetary institutions. And specifically, that would mean that countries that did not yet have an independent central bank would now revise their central bank laws and grant independence to their central bank. And if you look at the numbers, you see that countries like Italy, Spain, and France, who did not have independent central banks, moved on and granted independence to their banks. In the second stage, we should see then convergence on economic indicators, and those are the key convergence criteria. So we would keep, countries need to keep inflation low, and it must not be greater than 1.5% over the lowest inflation rate within the system. Countries should not have a fiscal deficit that's greater than 3% of GDP, and the debt level must not be higher than 6% of GDP. It turns out that barely any country, even Germany, did not meet this criteria. Nonetheless, we started with a union in 1999. A key feature is the European Central Bank, which is a highly decentralized system. So we have the national central banks that then form are part of the European Central Bank. And what this essentially does is it's simply modeled after the German Bundesbank. The Bundesbank has exactly the same structure. You have the regional banks that form the Bundesbank, and both of them, the European Central Bank and the German Bundesbank, are highly independent. So the ECB is modeled after the Bundesbank, essentially. And that was one condition from Germany to actually accept this system. So in 1991, everybody was very happy, right? Because we did not have devaluations for a long time. And everybody thought this is going to work out really smoothly. But this turns out not to be the case. So in June 1992, Denmark had a referendum on the Maastricht Treaty. And everybody expected that the Danish population would actually approve the Maastricht Treaty. And it turns out that they voted no. So that led to renegotiations and led to what's called the Edinburgh Protocol that allowed, so that's a separate treaty, that allowed Denmark not to be part of this European Monetary Union. Or it actually allowed Denmark to have another referendum later on whether they want to be part of it. And they had this referendum in the year 2000, and then they rejected to become member of the Eurozone. So with this, we saw, after this no, suddenly we saw a lot of speculation against certain currencies. So why could a political event like that's specific to one country suddenly trigger speculation against the British pound, the Italian lira, and so on? So it's all about credibility. With this unexpected no, it was suddenly not clear whether the EMU would actually come and whether the countries like Italy and France would still have the political will to implement the reforms or to implement the reforms that are necessary to establish this system. So there was speculation against the British pound in August 1992, and the British pound was devalued pretty quickly. Then on September 20, there was another referendum in France. And suddenly it wasn't clear whether the French population would also approve the Maastricht Treaty. So the speculators started to speculate against the French currency. Then, and so we saw contagion throughout the whole system. So they attacked the Swedish currency, which was defended with really, really high interest rates. So the Swedish National Bank increased interest rates up to 500%. So speculation decreased. That was in September, but then it resumed in November, and the Swedish currency was devalued in November 1992. So eventually, the only solutions that the countries found was to widen the band to 15%. So that was essentially a failure, right? But nonetheless, we saw the continuation of this project, and the euro started in 1999. So what does this mean in terms of our conceptual framework that we had? We talked about our unholy trinity in the last session. What does the unholy trinity say? What's the key proposition of this framework? So the idea is that we have three goals. We have one goal could be capital mobility. The second is an autonomous monetary policy. And the third one is a fixed exchange rate. And this is how the three systems varied on these three dimensions. So the Bretton Woods system, as we discussed before, allowed countries to restrict capital mobility. That was the Keynesian compromise, right? And this allowed them to have an autonomous monetary policy and have a fixed exchange rate. In the snake, there was rising capital mobility, which meant that we need to restrict one of the two others. So countries wanted to have an autonomous monetary policy, and that's why they failed to have a fixed exchange rate, right? And the key distinction now is that in the European monetary system, we still have high capital mobility. Countries wanted to have a fixed exchange rate, and they agreed now to give up monetary policy autonomy, right? So that's the key distinction from the snake to the EMS, that countries agreed or accepted that they would not have monetary policy autonomy anymore in this new system. And the question now is why, right? So the whole unholy trinity framework doesn't tell us. This just tells us what the constraints are. It does not tell us what countries actually do. So the question is, why do we move from monetary autonomy to no monetary autonomy? And this is these are mostly political decisions. So we have various explanations on this issue. The first one is the optimum currency areas theory, which is an economic explanation. But we're going to focus more on the political ones. So the first one is, why did country do this? Why did they give up monetary autonomy? The first one is to gain credibility. So we had a whole 45 minutes on this question, how countries can gain economic credibility. The second one is about interest groups. And then we're going to quickly touch upon interstate bargaining which has some explanatory power, but it's not that fully convincing as a whole, as an explanation of the whole system. And then we're going to look at ideas again. So we looked at Keynesian ideas, we looked at monetarist ideas. So here again, ideas can explain quite a lot. What's really important to understand here is that the ideas explanation is contradictory and competing with the credibility and the interest group argument. I'm going to work out the causal mechanisms in a moment, and you're going to see exactly how. Okay, let's quickly review optimum currency areas, and that goes back to Mandel, who won the Nobel Prize for his work, also on optimum currency areas. So there's a trade-off. It starts from the trade-off that we have benefits and costs, obviously. So what would be why should we have a common currency? Why is that attractive from an economic point of view? Yes. So it's all about trade, and why does it facilitate trade? So there's transaction costs when you have currencies that arise from volatility and exchange rate variation. So this reduces transaction costs and increases trade. So this is directly related to what we talked about, the motivations for preferential trade agreements. It's the idea is to expand your market in order to benefit from economies of scale. What is the cost? Why would you not want that? Yes. So you fully give up monetary autonomy, right? And the problem here is that if you have a shock, if unemployment increases unexpectedly, for instance, you cannot use this monetary policy anymore to offset this shock. So that led, this logic, which is very simple, led to a list of criteria that tells us whether we should have, are in an optimum currency area, and whether we should have a monetary union or not. So the benefits are directly relate, the first set of criteria directly relates to the trade question. So if you are a system that's highly open, where countries trade a lot with each other, and there's a lot of financial flows, then you should have, or you would benefit from such a system. The cost factors are a bit more important. So the first one is that we should have symmetric shocks within the system to make it actually work. So what we still can have in the system, we can have autonomy for the whole system, right? The ECB still has monetary autonomy because the ECB or the Eurozone has a flexible exchange rate vis-a-vis other currencies like the dollar, right? So you still have monetary autonomy for the monetary union as a whole. The problem is that within the system, the units don't have autonomy. So Greece has no autonomy, or Greece alone, or Germany alone, or other units don't have autonomy. So if there's asymmetric shocks between Greece and Germany, or Netherlands and Spain, if they experience different types of shocks, you cannot use you don't have the autonomy to offset a shock in a particular region, right? So that's the first problem. Now suppose you do have asymmetric shocks. One solution could be to have labor mobility. So if one region experiences a shock, and think about the United States, you could think about the United States as a monetary union. If you have a shock in Massachusetts, you cannot tailor monetary policy directly to Massachusetts, but what you could have is that people who get unemployed, they move to a different region in the United States and work there. And that's what's happening. So Massachusetts is a good example. In Massachusetts, there was a boom in the 1980s with so-called microcomputers, but then there was a shift towards personal computers, and the microcomputer industry in Massachusetts declined, and unemployment was rising. And a few years later, 5 years later, in the mid-1990s, unemployment went down again, but not because there was more employment in Massachusetts, but simply because people moved away from Massachusetts to other regions in the United States that were booming. So do we have that, or what are the policies within the Eurozone that actually speak to labor mobility? Do we see anything in the EMU that tries to make that work, to increase labor mobility? Yes. Exactly. So so that's one of the key pillars of Europe, the free movement of people, right? And one motivation is to actually allow for labor mobility. That's the economic motivation here, that the union, the EMU, only works if there is free movement of people, right? Can you see other policies? So you can interpret the Bologna reforms of the university systems also in this context, right? So that's a harmonization of educational standards that encourages or facilitates the movement of people from one country to another. Because now it's clear how one degree, one university degree in a country is translated into, or is accepted, or evaluated in another country. So harmonization of educational standards is crucial for labor mobility. So all these policies that seem to be purely political, they are also related to this idea of labor mobility. Another important aspect is wage price flexibility and the cushioning mechanism through fiscal transfers. Do we have something like that in Europe? Do we have fiscal transfers in Europe, or how do they look like? So there's the EU structural funds. The EU structural funds transfer money from the richer regions to the poorer regions. The problem here is that they're not as flexible, that they are multi-year plans. They don't respond to unexpected shocks within a particular year. Yes?
Do we have the detached workers directive, whereby workers pay their social insurance in their home country, or is that not transfer?
That's more to ensure, to avoid, but it facilitates. What that means more is that it reduces opposition against labor mobility, right? It means the idea is that you would not migrate into a social system which you haven't paid in before. Is that what you mean? So it's related. It's not exactly the same. It's related in the sense that it reduces opposition to labor mobility. It encourages temporary labor mobility, actually, but it's not a permanent way of labor mobility. So would you say, yeah?
What about when the European Central Bank buys bonds?
So that's a new phenomenon. We're going to talk about this in a moment. But this is not, do you think, well, you would classify this under fiscal transfers, or how would you call that? Yeah, it's not explicitly a fiscal transfer. It amounts to one in some ways, but it's a monetary policy tool to allow for fiscal transfers. It's a bit different, right? So is the EMU an OCA? What would you say? And why not? Or why? Well, I gave you the answer. Why is the EMU not an optimum currency area? So to what extent do these criteria apply to the EMU? Yes?
There's no real labor mobility as there's one in the United States.
So there was an attempt to increase labor mobility. Labor mobility is already fairly high, but not as in the United States. You say why? So there's other restrictions like language and so on, right? Okay. What else? What about symmetry of shocks? So shocks are highly asymmetric, and that's what the Euro crisis shows, right? You had a shock in the European South, and you did not have the same shock in the European North. So a few researchers examined this, whether shocks are symmetric, and what they found is that a strong distinction emerges between the supply shocks affecting the countries at the center, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark, and very different supply shocks affecting other EC members, the UK, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Greece. So what you see here, you see a list of the crisis countries, right? Now this was written in 1992, right? So we knew, so that's pretty telling that already in 1992, this study identified a distinction, two groups of countries that turned out to be really crucial 15 years later, right? So we knew it's not an optimum currency area. So OCA cannot be the explanation of the Eurozone. So what is the explanation? Well, one argument was made that it was all about European German unification. So this was the time when Germany unified in 1990, and this was a deal between the countries that Germany would be allowed to unify, but Germany would become so strong that it needs to be integrated further to tame it down. So that's one argument, that EMU was the price Germany had to pay for its unification. More plausible arguments about are referred to interest. So I'm going to quickly show you the results, but this is exactly the same logic that we discussed 2 weeks ago. That's exporting interest want more stability, and those countries that export a lot to the German market, they push for integration while the others are less enthusiastic. So what about the others? Why would they then accept EMU if they don't have such strong exporting interests? Well, it's about credibility. So this argument has been made about especially Italy, that Italy used the peg, the fixed exchange rate with the German mark, as a way of borrowing credibility. You tie yourself to a highly credible central bank, the Bundesbank, and this, and you can at the same time use that bank as a scapegoat for the policies that you're pursuing vis-a-vis your own electorate. And the third explanation, it's all about economic beliefs. So that there's a neoliberal consensus that was emerging in the 1970s and 80s that led to a convergence of attitudes, and EMU is a consequence and not a cause of the low inflation policy. So that's an argument that's exactly opposite to the credibility argument. Credibility says we have a commitment, we have a credibility problem, we add the EMU, and that leads to low inflation. Economic beliefs argument says we had a change in attitudes, that led to to conversions of inflation, and that led to the EMU, right? So the EMU now is not a cause of low inflation, but it's a consequence. That's a key distinction in the arguments. So let me quickly go through this. So the Frieden argument, and we read Frieden already 2 weeks ago, when he motivated the different interests for certain types of exchange rates. And in this argument, and that's why I call it the real reason, it's all about the real economy. It's about production and trade, and it's not about monetary affairs. So in this logic, the real reasons, or the reasons are, you have to look for the real sector, the production sector. So EMU is driven by trading. And the main concerns were exports and imports to Germany, and he examines this by looking at to what extent countries in the European monetary system allowed the exchange rate to fluctuate within the band and to depreciate within the band. So those are the dependent variables, exchange rate depreciation and exchange rate variability. And he says it's all about exports to Germany. So I'm going to show you the results. So he runs a regression model and he examines this, and I'm going to make this a bit bigger. So the dependent variable, as I said, is the coefficient of variation, and the independent variables is the manufacturing exports to the German mark zone as a percentage of GDP. And what you see here is that you have a negative coefficient, which means that countries that export more to the German mark zone, they see lower variation in their exchange rate, right? And then what he finds is he classifies countries by groups. So you have a group with a hard peg, and that's Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark. Those are the countries that have the strongest exporting interests, and they have the lowest variation in exchange rate. Then we have an intermediate group, which is France and Ireland, and then we have a soft group, which has weak exporting interests and has a high degree of variation, and that's the UK, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Portugal. And because of this, credibility arguments, because of credibility, so the South was looking for credibility, the North wanted to export to Germany, and that's why their monetary policy converged. And that shows you how. So this is the inflation rate, the blue line is the inflation rate of France, and the green line is the inflation rate of Germany, from 1960 to 2010. And what you see is that, so this is the end, towards the end of the Bretton Woods system, we saw German inflation rate rising. That was one of the motivations why Germany dropped out of the Bretton Woods system. And after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, Germany turned around and decreased inflation massively. While the French inflation rate increased further. So this is 1979 when the European monetary system was established. And the inflation rate increased further in France with the election of Mitterrand, but then they turned around and changed monetary policy, and the inflation rate decreases. It decreases to the level of Germany in 1990. Here you can see the effect of German unification, where German inflation rate increases for a while and goes down again. And then with the start of the Eurozone, the inflation rate is exactly the same. So we see a convergence of inflation rates. So an alternative explanation is that this is not about interest, this is not about credibility, this is all about what countries believe they could do and could not do. And we talked about the Phillips curve a few weeks ago. And what McNamara says is that there was a neoliberal consensus emerging that said that expansionary policies that basically relied on the Phillips curve trade-off did not work anymore. And the consensus was now that these policies and inflation don't produce employment, they just produce uncertainty about future prices. And uncertainty is harmful for investments and growth. So the only way to promote growth now, under this new consensus, is that we have price stability, and governments intervene as little as possible. So why did elites think that way now? The reason is that there was a perceived failure of Keynesianism in the 1970s. And an alternative policy paradigm emerged, which was monetarism, that seemed to confirm the German success in that period. And what happened in the 1970s was a series of shocks, the so-called oil shocks in 1973 and 1979. And the countries, the European countries, responded very differently to the first oil shock. So Germany became more restrictive in its economic policy, while Italy and Britain became more expansionary, and France was in between. But Germany got out of this crisis much better than the expansionary countries. So we see how this changes the behavior in the second oil shock in 1979. Now with the second oil shock, all the countries except France under Mitterrand responded more restrictively. Germany, Britain, France initially, and then again after 1983 and Italy. So we see a change in the way how countries and governments responded to very similar shocks, because there was a shift in the ideas how we should address these problems. So to illustrate to you what this means in terms of causal mechanism, let's go through both of them. Let's first think about the credibility argument, right? So what is the dependent variable in the credibility argument? Sorry. So in the credibility argument, the dependent variable is inflation convergence. Oh, sorry. Should tell me if you can see things. So the dependent variable is inflation convergence. What is the independent variable? Yes. The European Monetary Union comes in as an explanatory variable, but in a particular way. The problem first is we have a commitment problem. Which is particularly severe in Italy, for instance, or Spain. And we talked about this 2 weeks ago when we talked about the political and incentives for governments to actually produce inflation, right? And some countries can do this better, can restrain inflation better than others for institutional reasons. And how the EMU comes in is as an intervening factor. So the European monetary system and the European monetary union come in like this, right? So the commitment problem is, the differences in commitment problems between Germany and Italy is large without an EMU. And if you add the EMU or an EMS, then this differences in commitment problems diminishes, becomes smaller, and therefore differences in inflation become smaller and inflation converge, right? That's the mechanism of the credibility argument. So let's look at the ideas argument. What is the dependent variable in the ideas argument? By McNamara. Where does inflation convergence stand vis-a-vis EMU and EMS? So EMU is the dependent variable. Monetary or European monetary integration more generally. And what explains it? What's the independent variable here? Ideas, and especially the neoliberal consensus, which is equivalent to the abolishment of Keynesian norms and this leads to inflation convergence, right? So you don't believe in the Phillips curve again anymore. You don't believe in the idea that you can use fiscal policy, monetary policy, to expansionary monetary policy to reduce, to address economic shocks like the oil shock. You don't believe in this anymore because Germany doesn't do it and does much better while Italy does it and does much worse. So you change your behavior, you all move to a more restrictive policy, inflation converges, and that ultimately leads to the European monetary integration, right? So I think this really shows nicely how the two arguments differ. So this also shows you why it's so important to think about causal mechanisms behind arguments and why you should think in terms of what's the cause and what's the effect, what's the independent variable and what's the dependent variable, right? So these arguments differ massively in terms of what's the cause and what's the effect. Here, EMU is a cause that causes inflation convergence. In the ideas argument, EMU is the effect that just happens because something deeper changed, which is ideas, right? So those two arguments are competing arguments about the emergence of European monetary integration. And it shows you how they differ. And the key difference here is that, and that's a key debate between constructivists and rationalists in social sciences. So here, the idea in a constructivist argument like this one, ideas and norms, how they change, is always the starting point. And that causes a behavior. This behavior potentially then again feeds back into norms, but the norm is the key factor. While here in a rationalist argument, EMU or an institution is an independent factor that then causes changes in outcomes, right? So that's the key distinction here.
Sorry, could you repeat what was the rate theoretical explanation? Which one is the realist?
Rationalist, not realist. So a rationalist argument is a credibility argument. You have a set of interests of actors, in this case, political actors in Italy, for instance, and France, they have an incentive, a political incentive, to generate inflation. And they cannot constrain themselves because the institutions don't allow them to do this credibly. So you start from interests of key actors, in this case, policymakers. And you add an institution that then constrains them in a credible way. So it's all about interests. In the other one, it's not about interests, it's about ideas, right? So this is the rationalist argumentation, relying on interests. This is the constructivist argumentation, relying on norms and ideas. Any other questions? Good. So let's take a break. Come back at 11:20, and then we're going to talk about the crisis. Okay, let's start again. So, as we all know now, the Eurozone is not an optimum currency area. There are political reasons why we see the Eurozone. Now, what is the problem of this Eurozone? And here, this picture shows you this problem on one slide. So what this is from 2002 to 2012. These are the current account balances of the different countries. So remember, we talked about current accounts a lot before, and here in the Eurozone crisis, they are crucial. So here, this is Germany, and we see that Germany has a current account surplus, which is constantly growing. So those are just absolute numbers. So Germany is the biggest country, so it has the biggest share. But it basically shows that from year to year, the current account surplus is increasing. The same for the Netherlands and Austria. And then we've got Spain, Greece, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, and France, which all have deficits. And they are continuously increasing these deficits over time within the Eurozone. So what's the problem here? What does that mean? We talked about current accounts and we talked about the US deficit towards the end of the Bretton Woods system, which led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. What is the problem of current accounts? Deficits especially. What do these countries do? Yes. Exactly. So Spain, Greece, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, France, they were in some ways spending more than they were earning as a whole, as a country as a whole, right? So if you look at the trade balance, which is the most important component of the current account, that means that they are exporting less than they're importing, and someone has to pay for it, right? So you borrow money from those who have a surplus to pay for this. Now that doesn't work forever, right? This only works as long as somebody gives you money, and you only get the money if your donor believes that you will pay it back eventually. And if I have doubts that you will pay it back, I'm not going to give you money anymore. And that's exactly what happened, right? So how do we get rid of this? How do we get rid of the deficits? We talked a lot about adjustment mechanisms. Yeah. Exactly. So through deflation, you push a country into recession, prices decrease, that's deflation, your goods become more competitive on the international market, then the Germans will start to buy more Italian goods, and the trade deficit of Italy disappears, and the trade surplus of Germany also disappears. That's internal adjustment under a fixed exchange rate, because the Eurozone de facto is a fixed exchange rate regime. There is an alternative, which is under a flexible exchange rate. You could actually devalue, then your goods also become more competitive on the world market, and the exchange rate, the imbalances disappear, the current account imbalances disappear. What does this remind you of, the idea of internal adjustment? Where have we heard about this? Yes. So Greece, the Greek austerity measures do exactly that. Austerity is a way of deflating an economy, reducing prices, right? You spend less, then prices decrease. So, but in our course, when have we talked about a similar situation? Yes. So the price PC flow model is proposed exactly the adjustment mechanism we just reviewed, internal adjustment. And when did it work? When did it not work in the history of the world economy? So this is exactly the mechanism that was also underlying the gold standard. So everything that applied to the gold standard also applies to the Eurozone. And we learned back then that the gold standard did not work after the First World War because the gold standard relied on undemocratic politics. Because those who benefit from this were capital owners. And those who paid the price were workers. And that's why the gold standard did not work anymore in the 1930s and 1920s. So here we have exactly the same situation. We need internal adjustment, which is politically contentious, and that's exactly what we see in those countries that should adjust internally: Spain, Greece, Portugal, and Italy. Okay, so let's first talk about, we're going to talk about this in a moment, but let's first talk about where this all comes from. One popular argument is about fiscal slack, which says, well, those countries were just spending too much money, right? They didn't have their spending under control. Another one is about competitiveness, that there is something about the Eurozone that constantly makes some countries or firms in some countries less competitive and constantly improves the competitiveness of firms in other countries. And, and another argument is about saving capital flows. If you have a fixed exchange rate, you have reduced risk of devaluation. There's more flows into capital scarce countries. So we're going to focus on the first two and discuss them. So what about fiscal slack? How could you test that? What would you do to see if this fiscal slack argument is actually valid? Well, you simply look at the numbers and look whether these countries were, the governments of these countries were overspending consistently. So this is public debt of countries as a percent of GDP from 2000 to 2014. I'm going to make it a bit bigger. Okay, so what you see here is this blue line is Ireland, the red line is Spain, the purple line is Portugal, the red line here is Italy, and this is Greece. So what we see is that Ireland and Spain, so the gray lines are all the other EU countries. So what we see is that in Spain and in Ireland we saw low public debt, and we saw actually declining public debt until the crisis hit. So the crisis hit in 2008, 2009. And only with the crisis we saw this massive increase in public debt in Ireland and in Spain, right? So Portugal was more at the top of the European countries in terms of spending, but spending was increasing a bit. So Italy has a high debt level, but it was actually stable and not increasing. So for a long time we thought Italy's debt level was not a problem, until suddenly the crisis hit and suddenly we thought it was a big problem. So that's a bit puzzling, right? So what this shows you is that in principle there's no systematic evidence for the fiscal slack argument, right? Instead, what we saw was low public debt in major crisis countries, declining public debt in major crisis countries, but an increase of private debt in all of these countries. So in Spain, for instance, this was money that went into housing construction, or in Ireland, right? And then when we saw the crisis, this private debt was transformed into public debt, right? So in Ireland specifically, what happened was that all this private debt was in the banks, and it was held by the banks. And then, when the crisis hit, the Irish finance minister said that the government would actually back all this private debt. So this private debt suddenly became public debt, but it was not public debt before, right? So there was no fiscal slack on the side of the Irish government, But when the crisis hit, they backed the private debt and then eventually took on this private debt. Right? So that's a difference, right? So it's all about the private credit market and not about the public credit market. So we can refute this idea that there was fiscal slack, systematic fiscal slack in these European countries. So what is it then? And the political economy argument is all about competitiveness. So we talked about competitiveness in the second week. And what we discovered then was that there's a systematic relationship between wage bargaining coordination across different sectors of the economy. So that's an institution that we have in different countries. In some countries we see high coordination. In others we see no coordination across economic sectors, especially the public sector and the tradable sector. And this has a massive effect on trade. That's the outcome here. So if we have low coordination, these countries, so for instance the United States, New Zealand, Canada, Great Britain, these countries systematically have a current account deficit. If you have high coordination, Netherlands, Japan, Austria, then we have current account surplus. So that's what we have on the y-axis, the current account. So how does it work? So we talked about this in the second week. So the problem is, so we have an exporting sector and a non-tradable sectors in all countries. Now the exporting sector wants to keep wages low, right? Because that means that those goods, that the price of their goods on the world market are low. But the private sector wants to increase wages independent of the export sector, right? So suppose you have a system where systematically you see greater increase of wages in the public sector than in the exporting sector. What would you do? Well, eventually you start to work, there's a flow of labor from the exporting sector, the tradable sectors, to the public sector, right? That means that also wages in the export sector eventually have to increase because there will be a shortage of labor in that sector. So coordinated wage bargaining, which means that the exporting sector sets a benchmark for the wage increase and the public sector follows it, that means that this facilitates wage compression because there will be no competition from the public sector for the exporting sector. That's the idea. So current account, especially the current account balances and the trade balance especially, increase with coordination because it leads to wage compression. So we talked about this in the second week. So this is what the paper by Johnson, that's a required reading for today. This pushes this a bit further. So they ask, how does the euro actually enter the picture? And the euro means, so they make the same argument that coordination reduces wage growth in the sheltered sector. The sheltered sector is the non-tradable sector, which is the public sector especially. And the euro magnifies the effect of wage bargaining. Because wage compression is a way of internal adjustment, right? You keep wages low internally. But what you could do if that doesn't work, and that's what Italy did in the past, you just devalue, right? And you restore competitiveness. And the euro actually takes away this opportunity. So with the euro, you have already these differences between wage bargaining system across countries, and with the euro, the effect of this system magnifies. So that's what they do. They classify this system so by the extent to which the bargaining system, so the collective bargaining, the wage bargaining institutions allow countries to reduce or allow a reduction of wage growth in these in the sheltered sector, which allows the export sector to become more competitive. And what they say is that here we have pattern bargaining, which means that here the export sector sets the lead. They set the benchmark, and the others follow. And that's the case in Austria, Germany, Japan, and Sweden. And or the state actually takes that function. So in the pattern bargaining system, it's not, the government has no role. It's actually the labor unions and the employers who do that autonomously. So there's no interference of the German or the Austrian government with wage bargaining in these countries. In other countries, like in Belgium and France, that's what the government does. And you have collective wage bargaining decisions that do not restrain public sector wage growth, especially, so this is especially in Italy, Portugal, and Spain, in Australia, Canada, and the UK and the US. So you can totally see how, especially this group, in our previous picture, was consistently running trade deficits, while this group was consistently running wage surpluses, current account surpluses, sorry. So you see this? So the US, Britain, Australia, and here we've got those with high coordination. Okay. So the bottom line is that the Eurozone is a lot about competitiveness and not so much fiscal slack, right? It's all about to what extent firms are able to compete on the common market by compressing wages. Okay, so that's the sources of the crisis. So let's look at the obstacles to crisis resolution. And we have three problems here. The first one is at least the initial absence of a lender of last resort. So we encountered the idea of a lender of last resort already when we talked about Kindleberger's hegemonic stability theory. So what does a lender of last resort do? Remember, one of the 5 functions that a hegemon had was to act as a lender of last resort in times of crisis. What does a lender of last resort do? So if there is uncertainty about the future of the economy, nobody's going to lend money to the other, to other actors anymore, right? So what you need is a lender who takes over, who injects money into the system to take away this uncertainty problem. On the domestic level, that's what central banks are doing. So the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, for instance, in the crisis, immediately injected a massive amount of money into the American economy to partially to address the lender of last resort problem, right? And as we're going to see, Germany does not, the Eurozone does not have, at least initially, this solution. Then what we talked about already is the cost of internal adjustment. That internal adjustment is pretty massive. The cost of internal adjustment is massive. And I'm going to show you by comparing countries how big this is. And then on top of that, we need the Eurozone now is the solution of the Eurozone requires international bailouts, so transfers of money from the northern countries to the southern countries, and the political problems behind these mechanisms increase uncertainty further. So let me illustrate the lender of last resort problem. And what we can do is we can look at 2 countries that are in some ways similar. So we look at Spain and the United Kingdom, and we looked at them already before. We saw that the public debt levels are about the same. So there should not be more concern about Spain than the UK. So they experienced a fiscal banking crisis in 2008. They had similar fiscal deficits and debt levels, but there's a key difference, which is that the UK still has its own currency, and the Bank of England has monetary autonomy and acts as a lender of last resort. Just like the Federal Reserve Bank, they injected a lot of money into the system to address confidence problems. Spain is a member of the Eurozone, has a common policy that's not tailored to the Spanish economy. And the ECB, for a long time, actually refused to act as a lender of last resort, right? They said the solution is austerity and not the ECB injecting more money into the system. So that was until Draghi's famous statement in 2012 that the ECB will do everything it takes to save the euro. And that was a shift when the ECB actually took on the role of as a lender of last resort and started to buy government bonds. So you can look at this. So this is the fiscal deficit. So the red line is Spain, or the fiscal balance, and the green line, the blue line is the United Kingdom. And what we see is that the UK had a greater deficit, so negative numbers mean deficit, positive numbers mean a surplus. So Spain was in surplus before the crisis, while the UK was already in deficit. When the crisis hit here in 2008, spending patterns of the two countries are pretty much identical, right? If you look at public debt, so the red line is Spain. Public debt was increasing, was lower in Spain than in the United Kingdom. But then the interest rate that investors charged on government bonds in Spain, so that's the red line, exploded after the crisis, while it actually was going down in the United Kingdom. So we have countries that are almost identical when it comes to fiscal policy. They have the same debt level, they have the same fiscal deficit, but the amount of interest that investors charge these countries to borrow more money varies massively. And the key explanation here is that the UK had monetary policy autonomy, and the Bank of England actually helped the UK government, while the Spanish government did not have autonomy and the ECB did not help the Spanish government until this intervention by Draghi. So these are just the numbers relative to the other European countries. So again, the red line is Spain in terms of interest rates. The blue line is the United Kingdom, and the other country, so what you see in the background, so this is Greece and Portugal and Spain and Ireland. So the point is that the lack of a lender of last resort function of the ECB, which was an institutional design problem, meant that it really was very difficult to solve the crisis. Instead, the ECB and most European countries were relying, or European donor countries were relying on the idea that fiscal austerity should be the solution. And one idea which sounds a bit puzzling retrospectively, but which was really prevailing, was that fiscal austerity actually, you can impose fiscal austerity with very little cost. So this is the idea of so-called expansionary fiscal contractions. And this idea was put forward by a few economists in a paper in 1990, where they said that if you cut fiscal spending, well, that has a negative direct effect on the economy, right? If you spend less, the economy will doing worse. However, in such a situation where you have doubts about the fiscal capacity of a country, simultaneously you also increase confidence, because you anticipate that you solve the problem, you solve the fiscal problem, and that there will be no fiscal cuts in the future. So this means that fiscal cuts produce an increase in confidence, which boosts private investment. And private investment offsets public investment cuts. That's the argument here. So you can have a fiscal contraction which produces a private expansion. And therefore, the cost of this expansion is very small. So the idea here is that you can do austerity without running into troubles that I discussed when we talked about the gold standard. That's the idea here. And that was very popular in the ECB. So this is this graph shows you how often this idea of expansionary fiscal contractions appeared in ECB publications, especially in the monthly bulletins of the ECB. So this is a former student of mine who quoted how often an ECB monthly bulletin refers to this idea that you could cut fiscal spending without having a negative effect on the economy. And you see this became more and more popular in the mid-2000s. The idea disappeared a bit. And then when the crisis hit, the ECB was referring again and again to this idea that we should solve the problem, the Eurozone crisis, by austerity, which could come at very little cost. So here's an example. This is the ECB monthly bulletin in 2002, where they say that direct effects of austerity on demand in the short term should be counteracted by higher credibility of the conduct of fiscal policy, boosting confidence and thus private spending. So the problem is it didn't work, right? And to see that, we can compare Spain now with Iceland. Now, Iceland sounds like a crazy, not a good comparison country at first glance, but if you look at it, it's again very similar to Spain. What you have is a banking crisis that was driven by a pre-crisis boom in both countries, which made the tradable sectors uncompetitive. But the response was very different. The response in Spain was not devaluation because they simply couldn't devalue. It was internal adjustment through austerity. While Iceland did the opposite. They devalued the currency by 35% in 2009. And the outcome was very different. So now Spain is the blue line here. That's growth rates of Spain from 2006 to 2014. And Iceland is the red line. So growth was positive before the crisis. Iceland, so this is when the crisis hit. So Iceland, the Icelandic growth rate declined. They devalued immediately. So growth was, so they pushed, they dropped into a severe recession for 2 years. And in the third year after the recession, the economy started to boom again. So here we've got a growth rate of 2%, 2%, more than 4%, right? Now look at Spain. Spain did not devalue. They started to impose austerity. So the recession was less severe, but the problem was it was dragging on for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, right? So the Icelandic devaluation caused a severe recession that was over within 2 years. The Spanish response, by adjusting internally through austerity, caused a long recession, which then had political consequences because it led to the rise of populist movements and Podemos and government instabilities. So you can see how the different systems lead to different adjustment costs, which lead to different political outcomes in the long term. Okay, so internal adjustment is slower and more painful than external adjustment. That's the conclusion here. The third obstacle of Eurozone crisis resolution is that what we're now seeing is a transfer system from donor countries, especially Germany, towards creditor countries, which are the crisis countries. So this is evidence from a survey being done at the height of the Eurozone crisis in 2002, who in Germany actually supports this, who supports bailouts of Greece and a transfer of money towards the crisis countries. So the question was, how much are you in favor or against bailout payments for over-indebted EU countries? What you see here, that strongly in favor, somewhat in favor, or neither nor, this group is fairly small. Only 27% support bailouts, while more than 60% oppose these bailouts. So this is the condition under which the Merkel government, the German government was operating when it agreed to the bailout packages in crisis countries. So what explains this variation? So we still see a fairly big variation here, and so this is very small. So what they do is they examine socio-demographic factors, regional factors, economic self-interest factors, and social dispositions as key explanatory variables to explain the variation in support for European bailout packages. So what this means is this basically means that if a coefficient is around this line, which is 0, this variable does not have no effect. And what we see is that the only variables that have an effect is social disposition factors, especially what's called cosmopolitanism. So whether you see yourself as a cosmopolitan citizen, here it's very low or very high. What we see here is that those who think that who have cosmopolitan ideas, they are much less against these bailout packages. So the dependent variable is attitude against bailouts. So that means that the attitudes in Germany, they are unrelated to any economic interests. It's all about social disposition. So bailout, in this case, are not an issue of solidarity and economic interests and in maintaining the Eurozone. It's all considered a foreign policy issue. So it's all about economic nationalism versus cosmopolitanism and not about economic costs of breaking up the Eurozone. And you see something similar here when you ask in other countries, not just Germany, who agrees that we should have a Grexit, that Greece should leave the Eurozone. So they ask this question in France, in Italy, in the UK, and in Spain. And the only factor that drives different views on whether Greece should leave the Eurozone or not is all about the left-right division, and especially about the ideas that voters have about how the economy works. So in all countries, voters from the left are much more likely to oppose a Grexit than voters from the right. And you see that in Spain, in France, in Italy, and in the UK, in exactly the same magnitude. So it's all about how you think the economy works and not about economic interests or anything else. So what do we conclude? So what we can conclude here is that the European Monetary Union is not the result of economic decisions in the sense that there's this optimal policy that benefits the countries that become part of the system. It's mostly a result of political factors, and the fact that it's not an optimum currency area means that the imbalances that we see within the system are magnified by the system. So the EMU magnifies imbalances, so current account deficits and surpluses in Europe, and it's designed in a way that it exhibits massive rigidities that inhibit the resolution of the crisis, especially initially the absence of a lender of last resort function of the ECB, the focus on internal adjustment as opposed to external adjustment, and the third is the problems that arise with the bailouts and the politics behind it that we have seen in the last few years. Okay, so next week we're going to conclude this course and we're going to talk about what globalization, to what extent globalization and democracy are actually compatible or not. What this all means for democratic politics in contemporary democracies and how it actually fits together and does or does not.